So we're going to be solving some inequalities in this section, and they're going to want us to write the answers in what's called interval notation. So let's say you have a statement here. It says x is greater than -3 and x is less than or equal to 4. Well, on a number line, what that looks like then is here you are at -3 and here you are at 4. And what we're saying is we want all the numbers that are greater than -4, but they're also less than or equal to 4. Or greater, did I say 4? Greater than -3, but less than or equal to 4. So we're talking about all these numbers shown in this graph here. Maybe I can put it in a different color. You're going to use a parenthesis to say, I want the numbers just bigger than -3, like -2.999. That would be fine, but not actually at -3. Now you can't list all the numbers. There's an infinite number of numbers in there, so you can't list them all. We have to show it as a range, sort of. And then here at the end, the other end, we're using a square bracket to indicate, okay, we're going to include the 4. Okay? So when you have the bar underneath the symbol, you're going to use a bracket, a square bracket, one of those two. But if there's no bar, then you're going to use a parenthesis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now you'll notice I put 2 parentheses because it depends on which way it's facing. Okay. Now this represents then a graph of all the numbers that are greater than -3 and less than or equal to 4. Okay. So how do we write that? And that's a graph. This is a graph here. And sometimes they ask you to graph it, but how do we write it in what's called interval notation? It looks just like the graph pretty much. So you go parenthesis, -3, comma, to 4, and then a square bracket. That says all the numbers bigger than -3 and less than or equal to 4. It's the interval of numbers from -3 to 4, not including the -3, but including the 4. Okay. Another way to write this idea of numbers in between is what's called a compound inequality. So you see here in this statement we have x in the middle, and it's between -5 and -1. So I can make a number line. I always put 0 on the number line. And you can make lots of little marks. Sometimes I'm just lazy. Okay. Now, because it's got the bar, I'm going to have a square bracket. But I'm talking about all the numbers that are between -5 and -1. So I'm going to go square bracket on -5, square bracket on -1, and then I'm talking about all these numbers that are between there. Okay? That's the graph. Now the interval is written square bracket -5, comma, -1, square bracket. Okay. Now we'll keep reviewing this because we keep putting our answers in interval notation. So now we have a statement over here that says, well, we want x to be less than 1, or we want x to be greater than 4. An or statement means they don't both have to be true. One or the other one has to be true. They could both be true sometimes. They don't both have to be true. And means they both have to be true. So let's look at what this means. We're talking about this part here. X is less than 1. So we're talking about putting a parenthesis here at 1. And then we're talking about all the numbers less than 1. All those numbers are less than 1. Or we could have the numbers greater than 4. All those numbers that are bigger than 4. So anything between 1 and 4 we can't have. Like 2 doesn't work, 3 doesn't work. But these numbers less than 1 or greater than 4, all those numbers work. Now how do we write this? One thing my students sometimes like to do is they like to put a negative infinity here to show that to the left you're going toward negative infinity, and positive infinity on the right. As you go to the right, you're going toward positive infinity. Okay, now we always read our intervals off the graph from left to right. That's really important, so don't forget, left to right. Another thing, negative infinity, I'll write it down, negative infinity and infinity always get parentheses. Okay, so it's always going to be parenthesis, negative infinity, and parenthesis, infinity. Okay, so if you remember that, it'll help. Okay, so how do I write this picture that I've got here in interval notation? I start on the left. I'm starting at negative infinity, going to 1. And then I have to skip over some stuff, right? Like I'm skipping over to this other section. We connect that with what's called a union symbol. Now make sure you use the union symbol in MathPad for WebAssign. It's under sets. You can find these symbols for the parentheses and the brackets under, there's a little tab in MathPad called sets. Okay, this other group of numbers is going to go from 4 to infinity. And so that's the way that interval notation is written. Okay? All right. Now we're going to talk about a couple special cases. So let's say we're saying, okay, we want all the numbers less than or equal to 7. Okay, here's 0, here's 7. So we want all these numbers. Or we could have all these numbers. So at negative 2, I'll do a different color. I'm saying all the numbers bigger than negative 2. One or the other. Either you're less than 7 or you're bigger than negative 2. Well, if you look at that, doesn't that include all the numbers? So what we have here is we have all real numbers. Now some textbooks will write that, all real numbers. That would be the set of numbers we're talking about in this situation. But to write it in interval notation, we write it as parenthesis, negative infinity to infinity. Okay? All right. And then this last one says, I want x to be less than 2. Okay, so I want these numbers. Oops. Now, one thing about the parenthesis, some textbooks use what's called an open dot. I use the parenthesis because for interval notation, that'll make it easier for you. And then the square bracket, though, is like a closed dot. So if you've done these with another textbook, you may be used to the open dot and closed dot, but I recommend switching over for the interval notation to the parenthesis and bracket system. Okay, so back to this problem. We said, okay, x has to be less than 2, and it's also got to be greater than or equal to 6. Well, there aren't any numbers that do both those things. With an and, it would have to be in both sets, and we don't have any numbers that are both less than 2 and bigger than 6. That doesn't make any sense. So we say here there's no solution. WebAssign, I think they usually have you type no solution. Some textbooks will let you put the empty set like that or the empty set like that. For interval notation, there is no interval notation for it. You just say no solution or put the empty set. Okay, so that's a little bit about interval notation.